The air inside the courtroom was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that settled into the cracks of the old wooden benches and the worn-out carpet. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting a sickly yellow hue over the faces of those gathered. It was the kind of place where stories of injustice were told in whispers, where people learned early on that power wasn't always about what was right. It was about who held the gavel. At the center of it all, Maya Johnson sat at the defendant's table, hands folded, her back straight despite the weight of the moment. She could feel the stares, the hushed conversations, the way people leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse of the woman they assumed was doomed. The judge, an older man with deep lines etched across his forehead, leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into something between amusement and disdain. "So, you think you can defend yourself?" His voice carried through the room, condescending, laced with skepticism. Maya took in a slow breath. The scent of aged paper and stale coffee clung to the air. She could feel the cold of the metal handcuffs that had only just been removed pressing phantom-like against her wrists. Behind her, a soft chuckle sounded. Mark Reynolds, the officer responsible for her arrest, standing just a few feet away. He was enjoying this. His arms were crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, as if he had already won. Maya didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew that look well enough. She'd seen it before on men like him, men who believed the world owed them obedience. To her right, the prosecutor stepped forward, a man in a neatly pressed suit with the confidence of someone who had already written the ending to the story. "You really believe you have a chance against us?" he asked, shaking his head, as if he found the idea almost laughable. Maya tapped her fingers lightly on the table, steadying herself. She wasn't in control, not yet. But control was something that could be taken back. Then, just as she parted her lips to speak, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak. A man hurried inside, breathless, his tie slightly askew. A journalist. His eyes darted around before locking onto the prosecutor. He made his way up quickly, bending down to whisper something into the man's ear. Maya didn't move, but she saw it, the shift. The prosecutor's posture stiffened, his jaw clenched, a flicker of something close to uncertainty crossing his features. She exhaled softly, her pulse steady. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The weight of the judge's words still lingered in Maya's mind as she sat in that suffocating courtroom. How had she ended up here? The question echoed in her head, but she already knew the answer. Everything had started just the night before. The world around her blurred, the murmur of the courtroom fading as her thoughts pulled her backward in time. Darkness settled in, and then, headlights cutting through the night, the distant hum of an engine, the steady rhythm of tires rolling over smooth asphalt. She was back on I-55, heading home. The glow of the dashboard clock read 10:07 p.m. Outside, the Tennessee night stretched endlessly, the lights of passing towns flickering like distant fireflies. The road was quiet, mostly empty, save for the occasional 18-wheeler rumbling in the opposite direction. Maya's hands gripped the steering wheel lightly, her posture relaxed but her mind still buzzing from the long meeting she had just left. Her Lexus RX moved smoothly along the highway, the faint hum of the engine blending with the low chatter of the radio. Then came the news report. A Memphis police officer is under investigation following allegations of excessive force in a traffic stop earlier this week. Civil rights advocates are calling for an inquiry. Maya's fingers instinctively tightened around the wheel. It was nothing new. She had spent years defending people who had been unfairly targeted, pulled from their cars, beaten, or worse, all under the guise of routine stops. But hearing it now, with the empty highway stretching in front of her, sent an uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. She glanced at her rearview mirror. A pair of headlights trailed behind her. Close. Too close. For a moment she thought it might be just another driver. Maybe someone in a hurry, tailgating like people often did on open roads at night. But as she switched lanes, the car followed. Her heartbeat picked up, then the flash of red and blue. The sudden burst of color filled her mirrors. the sharp wail of a siren cutting through the quiet night. Maya took a steady breath. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't swerved. There was no reason for this stop. And yet, here it was. Pulling to the side of the road, she exhaled slowly, reaching over to turn on the interior light before rolling down her window. Footsteps approached. A large figure stepped into view, illuminated by the glow of her headlights. Mark Reynolds. Maya had seen his name before, attached to complaints that had never gone anywhere. His reputation for harassing black drivers was an open secret, and yet here he was, still patrolling the streets like a man untouchable. Behind him, another officer, Dan Murphy, lingered near the squad car. He looked younger, more uncertain, shifting on his feet as if he didn't quite belong there. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, his voice sharp. Maya kept her hands on the wheel. "Officer, can I ask why I'm being stopped?" His eyes narrowed. "License and registration," he repeated, slower this time, like she was a child who hadn't understood the first time. Maya didn't move. "With all due respect, sir, I'd like to know what infraction I committed." Reynolds scoffed. "Just a routine check." Routine. She'd heard that excuse before. From the corner of her eye, she saw Murphy hesitate, glancing between them. "Now step out of the vehicle," Reynolds ordered. Maya's jaw tightened. "Is there a reason for that request, officer?" "Because I said so." A long silence stretched between them. Maya's pulse was steady, but her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully. She had handled countless cases like this, fought for clients who had been dragged from their cars on the side of the road for daring to question authority. She knew the law better than most officers did, and yet she knew exactly what would happen if she pushed too hard. Still, she wasn't about to be bullied. "Sir, unless you have a valid reason to suspect me of a crime, I have the legal right to remain in my vehicle," she said, her voice measured. Reynolds' nostrils flared. "Murphy," he called over his shoulder, not breaking eye contact with her. "Open the door." Murphy hesitated. "Now." The younger officer stepped forward reluctantly, reaching for the handle. Before Maya could protest, Reynolds yanked the door open and grabbed her by the arm. She barely had time to react before she was dragged out of the car, the cool night air hitting her skin like a slap. Her knee scraped against the pavement as she stumbled forward. "Stop resisting," Reynolds growled. "I'm not—" Maya barely got the words out before she felt the cold snap of handcuffs around her wrists. The humiliation hit her first. Then came the rage. Pressed against the hood of her own car, she could hear everything. The quiet whir of passing cars, the distant chirp of crickets, the murmurs of people watching. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of a few bystanders standing near the gas station across the street. Some were holding up their phones recording. None of them moved to help. "Tell me," Reynolds leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. "Where's that attitude now, huh?" Maya clenched her teeth. This was exactly the kind of abuse she had spent her career fighting against, the kind that was ignored until it was too late. She forced herself to remain calm. She would not give him the satisfaction. Murphy shifted uncomfortably nearby, his face pinched with uncertainty. Maya caught it, the flicker of doubt, the hesitation. Maybe, just maybe, there was an opening there. Reynolds straightened. "Book her for resisting arrest," he called over his shoulder. Murphy hesitated. "Sir, Do it," Reynolds snapped. Maya let out a slow breath as she was hauled toward the squad car, the rough pavement scraping her heels. The reality of it all settled into her chest. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was war. She wasn't just going to sit back and let them bury her. Inside the cramped back seat of the patrol car, Maya focused on what she still had left. Her mind, her knowledge of the law, and something more important than all of it, a camera. Her car's dash cam had recorded everything. She just had to make sure she got to it before they did. Maya's fingers curled into fists. She had two choices now. She could accept her fate, let them win, or she could fight back. She already knew which one she would choose. The air inside the holding cell was thick, weighed down by the stench of sweat, damp concrete, and something else. Hopelessness. The overhead fluorescent light flickered inconsistently, casting eerie shadows across the room. The walls were lined with old scratched-up benches, and every few seconds, the distant buzz of a faulty electrical fixture added to the oppressive silence. Maya sat with her back against the cold wall, her wrists still aching from the tight grip of the handcuffs earlier. The adrenaline from the arrest had faded, but the anger remained, simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't the only one in here. Across from her, a woman with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes stretched her arms behind her head. She looked Maya over once before exhaling sharply. "Welcome to reality, sister," she muttered. Maya studied her. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark, wavy hair streaked with silver, a posture that suggested she had spent more nights in a place like this than anyone should have to. "Name's Elena," the woman continued. "Let me guess. You asked the wrong kind of questions to the wrong kind of cop." Maya gave a tight smile, but she didn't answer right away. To the left of Elena, a young black man, barely in his 20s, sat hunched over with his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. His sneakers were scuffed, his hoodie slightly torn at the sleeve. "Kevin," he said quietly, not looking up. Elena gestured toward him. "They picked him up for looking suspicious outside some rich folks' neighborhood. Wouldn't tell him why, just tossed him in here like they always do." A scoff came from the far corner of the cell. Maya turned toward the source, a blonde woman, maybe in her late 30s, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Angela," the woman said flatly. "Single mom, accused of stealing a damn pack of diapers from the pharmacy. Didn't matter that I had a receipt." She let out a bitter laugh. They just needed an excuse. Maya listened, taking in each story, feeling the weight of their words. It was all too familiar. Different faces, different circumstances, but the same corrupt machine grinding them down. She closed her eyes for a moment. No lawyer, no call, no rights that mattered in the moment. The system didn't care. But she did, and she had no intention of letting this slide. The door to the holding area creaked open. Maya lifted her head as two officers stepped inside, chatting amongst themselves. They barely glanced at the detainees, assuming, like so many before them, that those locked inside had no power, no influence, nothing but time to waste. But Maya wasn't just another woman in a holding cell. She leaned back, appearing casual, and listened. "Reynolds wants that damn video gone," one of the officers muttered under his breath. Maya's spine stiffened. "Yeah, I know," the other sighed. "Said we need to make sure nothing from her dash cam gets out. He's pissed someone was recording." Her pulse quickened. The camera. They knew about it. Then came another voice, one she recognized instantly. "Murphy." "But sir," he hesitated, "if we delete it and this blows up, do you like your job, Murphy?" Reynolds' voice cut through like a blade. Silence. Maya turned just enough to catch a glimpse of Murphy, standing awkwardly near the door, his fingers twitching at his sides. His face was pale, his eyes darting around like he was second-guessing every decision that had led him to this moment. Reynolds wasn't just trying to cover his tracks. He was willing to intimidate his own people to do it. And Murphy, despite his hesitation, was on the edge of compliance. Maya's mind raced. If she could use this, if she could get inside Murphy's head the way Reynolds was trying to, she might be able to flip the script. She studied his expression, the way his shoulders tensed as Reynolds laid down his authority. Murphy wasn't like the others. He still had a sliver of doubt, a crack in the armor. She could work with that. Maya exhaled slowly and leaned her head back against the cold brick wall, her thoughts piecing together a strategy. If she wanted to turn the tables, she had to be smart. Reynolds thought he had control, but he had no idea the game had just changed. James Carter sat at his cluttered desk, the dim glow of his laptop screen casting shadows over the mess of papers and half-empty coffee cups surrounding him. His fingers tapped idly against the keyboard as he scrolled through yet another dead-end lead. His once thriving career as an investigative journalist had been reduced to chasing ghosts, stories that no one wanted to touch, sources too afraid to speak, evidence that always seemed just out of reach. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when his byline had meant something, when his articles had sparked outrage, investigations, even change. But that was before he had pushed too hard, before he had exposed the wrong people, before he had been blacklisted. Now he was just another reporter trying to claw his way back into relevance. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a notification. A text message. Unknown number. Memphis PD is at it again. Woman in lockup. Traffic stop. Cover-up happening. Get there now. James narrowed his eyes, his mind already racing. He had received tips like this before. Anonymous messages claiming to have dirt on corrupt officers, half of them leading to nothing. But something about this one felt different. It was urgent, precise. He typed back quickly. Who's the woman? No response. He stared at the message for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. He had nothing else to go on, but his gut told him it was worth checking out. If there was even a chance that the Memphis PD was covering up something, he needed to be there. The air outside the Memphis Police Department's detention facility was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made your clothes feel heavier. James adjusted his baseball cap low over his eyes and approached the entrance casually, his press credentials tucked safely in his pocket. Getting inside wasn't going to be easy. Officially, journalists weren't allowed inside holding areas, but James had spent years cultivating contacts, officers, clerks, even janitors, people who saw things they weren't supposed to see and, for the right incentive, were willing to share. One of them was waiting for him by the side entrance. "You're late," the man muttered, glancing over his shoulder. James slipped him a folded bill. "I got here as fast as I could. Who's the woman they brought in?" The officer hesitated, his gaze shifting. "Name's Maya Johnson. Traffic stop. Some higher-ups are saying she resisted arrest, but—" He lowered his voice. "Word is, they're trying to get rid of some kind of evidence." James frowned. "What kind of evidence?" The officer shook his head. "I don't know the details, but Reynolds is involved. You know what that means." James clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that meant. Mark Reynolds had been a name whispered in countless stories of police misconduct, stories that never seemed to make it past the newsroom's legal team. He had a habit of making things disappear, and now he was involved with Maya Johnson. James didn't know who she was yet, but if Reynolds wanted something buried, then she was someone worth paying attention to. Inside the visitation area, James kept his posture relaxed as a guard led him into a small, sterile room. A thick pane of glass separated the visitors from the detainees, with a row of old telephones mounted on the wall. He sat down, picking up the receiver just as the door on the other side opened. Then he saw her. Maya Johnson was composed, even in an orange jumpsuit. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. Sharp, calculating. Not the eyes of someone beaten down, the eyes of someone thinking. She sat down across from him, picking up the phone with a slow, deliberate motion. "You're not family," she said. James smirked. "Number, but I hear you might have a story." For a long moment she studied him, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then finally she spoke. "I don't have time for games," she said. "Reynolds is trying to bury evidence. My dash cam recorded everything. If it disappears, so does my chance at proving what really happened." James leaned forward slightly. "What exactly did your camera capture?" "An illegal stop, an illegal arrest, and the moment Reynolds decided I was a problem." He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his chin. "If you're telling me the truth, this is huge, but getting that footage isn't going to be easy." Maya met his gaze, unwavering. "I don't need easy. I need possible." James was silent for a beat. He had chased stories like this before, stories that had led to courtrooms, protests, and sometimes worse. Helping her meant putting himself in the crosshairs of people who had no problem making journalists disappear. But something about Maya's confidence made him believe she wasn't just another case. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for a partner. After a long pause, he let out a slow chuckle. "All right, counselor," he said. "How do we do this?" A flicker of something close to relief passed over Maya's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She was already planning, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Murphy stood outside the holding cell, his hands resting at his sides, fingers tapping idly against his utility belt. The dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead did little to ease his nerves. It was late, and the weight of the evening had settled into his shoulders. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. 3 years on the force, and he had already seen enough to understand how things worked. Follow orders, keep your head down, don't ask too many questions. It was easier that way, safer. But tonight felt different. Maya Johnson sat on the bench inside the cell, watching him through the bars. Not with the anger or defeat he had expected, but with something sharper, curiosity. "Officer Murphy," she said smoothly, her voice calm despite the situation. "You look like a man who's carrying a heavy burden." Murphy hesitated. He shouldn't be engaging, shouldn't be letting her pull him into a conversation. But the way she spoke made it hard to ignore. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, shifting on his feet. "That's not true," Maya countered, tilting her head slightly. "I know you hesitated when Reynolds told you to delete that video. I know you didn't agree with how I was treated tonight. And I know you're wondering how deep this all goes." Murphy swallowed hard. "Be careful what you say, lady," he warned, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any second. Maya leaned forward slightly. "I'm not the one who needs to be careful. You are." His jaw tightened. "You ever ask yourself why you became a cop?" she asked. Murphy clenched his fists. "That's none of your business." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "I bet you wanted to do some good, protect people, make a difference. But here's the real question. Are you protecting justice, or are you just following orders?" He looked away, his throat dry. "You know what Reynolds is doing is wrong," Maya continued. "You knew it the second he told you to get rid of that footage." Murphy exhaled sharply, his hand moving instinctively to the radio clipped to his shoulder. He could shut this down right now, walk away, pretend he hadn't heard a word. But something about Maya's confidence unsettled him. She wasn't pleading or trying to manipulate him with fear. She was simply laying the truth in front of him and letting him decide what to do with it. "I can't help you," he muttered, "even if I wanted to." "You don't understand how this works." Maya raised an eyebrow. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to wear that badge, but I do know what it's like to be on the receiving end of its abuse. And I know people like Reynolds thrive on officers like you. Officers who stay silent because they're afraid." Murphy swallowed hard. "You have a choice," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. "You can either go along with this and become just another part of the machine, or you can step outside of it and actually make a difference." Murphy let out a slow breath. "If I do anything, I lose my job," he said, barely above a whisper. "If you don't do anything, you lose something bigger," Maya replied. "Yourself." His hands clenched at his sides, his mind spinning. "Reynolds is going to destroy that footage," she pressed. "And when that happens, there's no undoing it. You help me keep that video safe, and you're not just saving me. You're exposing an entire system that's built to protect men like him." Murphy shook his head. "You don't get it. It's not just him. There are people above him who want this buried." "I know," Maya said, "but every system has weak points. You just have to be willing to find them." Silence stretched between them. Murphy exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the ring of keys clipped to his belt. His fingers twitched against the cool metal. There were two paths in front of him now. One kept him safe. The other set everything on fire. He looked back at Maya. She didn't say anything, just watched, waiting, for him to decide who he really was. James Carter sat in the dim glow of his laptop screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The motel room he had checked into was barely more than a rundown hideaway, the kind of place no one asked questions. The curtains were drawn tight, a half-empty coffee cup sat next to him, and the faint hum of a broken air conditioner filled the silence. This was it. If he screwed this up, he wouldn't just lose a story, he'd lose everything. His phone buzzed. A message from an encrypted number. "File located, restricted access. Need manual override." He exhaled slowly and typed back, "ETA." A pause, then, "Working on it. You better be ready." James cracked his knuckles, pulling his laptop closer. He had called in a favor from one of the best hackers he knew, Anna Miller, a former cybersecurity analyst who had been blacklisted for exposing government corruption. She was the kind of person who didn't ask why, just how fast. He ran a hand through his hair and took another deep breath. This was more than just a routine data pull. He was about to breach a police database, If they caught him, he wouldn't be walking away with a slap on the wrist. But Maya was counting on him, and James didn't back down from a fight. At the Memphis Police Department, Murphy paced the hallway outside the records room, his stomach twisting in knots. It had taken hours for him to make this decision, but deep down, he knew there had never been another choice. He wasn't like Reynolds. He couldn't just look the other way. With one last glance around, he walked up to the duty officer at the front desk and tapped the counter. "Need access to room B7, he said, keeping his tone even. The officer barely looked up. "Why?" "Reynolds wants a full report on last night's incident," Murphy lied smoothly. "Said I should pull the footage myself." A beat of hesitation. Then with a shrug, the officer reached for his clipboard. "Sign in." Murphy scrawled his name quickly and took the keycard, forcing himself to walk casually toward the secured section of the building. If he got caught, there would be no talking his way out of it. His hands were clammy as he slid the card through the access panel. The red light blinked, then turned green. He stepped inside. James watched the screen as a string of codes scrolled down. Anna's messages came in rapid succession. "You're in. 10-minute window. Move fast." His heart pounded as he navigated through the firewall. They had found the right server, the data storage unit where body cam and dash cam footage was kept before being reviewed or erased. The video Maya had mentioned was still there, buried deep under restricted access protocols. James started the download. The progress bar inched forward. Then, error, external lock detected. His stomach dropped. A second notification flashed across the screen. Manual override required. Physical access needed. Shit, Murphy had to finish his part. James grabbed his phone, typing quickly. "You need to move now." Inside the records room, Murphy scrolled through the database. His fingers hovered over Maya's file. He knew Reynolds had planned to wipe it. He had heard the order himself. But for some reason, the file was still there. Had they been waiting for something? His phone buzzed in his pocket. A single word. Now. Murphy exhaled and clicked the override button. The file unlocked. He copied it onto a flash drive, heart racing as he ejected it and slipped it into his pocket. Then he sent the green light message to James. "Got it." As soon as he hit send, the door behind him creaked open. His blood ran cold. Reynolds stepped in. The older officer's gaze swept the room, sharp and searching. "What the hell are you doing in here, Murphy?" Murphy turned, keeping his expression neutral. "Pulling the footage you requested." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "That's funny, because I don't remember asking you to do that." Murphy's fingers twitched at his side. Reynolds took a step forward. "Now why don't you tell me what's really going on here?" Murphy forced himself to meet Reynolds' gaze, knowing he was seconds away from being caught. Then his phone buzzed again. James had the video, but now Murphy had to find a way out. Back at the motel, James let out a relieved breath as the download completed. The file was secure, but as he reached for his phone to text Murphy, his screen suddenly flashed red. "Access denied. Tracked user detected." His stomach flipped. The screen refreshed and a message appeared. "System breach detected. Law enforcement notified." They knew. James cursed under his breath, slamming the laptop shut. He needed to move, now. Reaching for his bag, he stuffed his gear inside and yanked the motel door open. Sirens wailed in the distance. They were coming. James Carter's pulse hammered in his ears as he grabbed his bag, shoving his laptop inside. The sirens outside weren't distant anymore. They were closing in fast. He had minutes, maybe less. He yanked the motel door open and stepped into the humid night air. The neon sign above flickered weakly, casting a pale blue glow onto the cracked pavement. Across the lot, 2 squad cars screeched to a stop, their headlights flaring. A radio crackled. "Suspect Carter, journalist, mid-30s, likely armed with stolen data. Approach with caution." James cursed under his breath. They didn't just know where he was, they were treating him like a criminal. He turned on his heels and bolted. The alley behind the motel was tight, littered with broken glass and discarded trash bags. His shoes pounded against the pavement as he sprinted, lungs burning. He could hear the officers shouting behind him, their boots slamming against the asphalt. "Stop! Hands where we can see them!" James ducked behind a dumpster just as a flashlight beam swept past. He flattened himself against the cold metal, forcing his breath to slow. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Anna, they're tracking your cell. Ditch it, now. He hesitated for only a second before yanking the back cover off and ripping out the battery. He tossed both pieces into a storm drain and kept moving. He had to get out of here. Reynolds stormed into the Memphis PD control room, his face twisted in fury. "Where is he?" he barked, eyes scanning the surveillance monitors. A tech officer, fingers flying across the keyboard, grimaced. "He severed the connection before we could lock him down. But we traced the last ping. Cheap motel off I-240. Units are closing in." Reynolds clenched his fists. "I want him in custody. Now." The officer hesitated. "Sir, if he's got the video, then we make sure he never gets the chance to use it," Reynolds growled. "Understood?" The room went silent. James kept running, his legs screaming in protest. He veered into another alley, heart slamming against his ribs. Then he heard it, a low rumble. He barely had time to react before a police SUV rounded the corner ahead, blocking the path. The driver slammed the brakes, tires screeching. James skidded to a halt. Behind him, the officers from the motel were closing in. He was trapped. His mind raced. If they caught him now, that video would never see the light of day. A low buzzing filled his ears, panic threatening to take over. Then, a message popped up on his smartwatch screen. "North Side, black sedan, now." Anna. James didn't waste time questioning it. He spun on his heel and sprinted toward the side street. A black car was idling near the curb, engine running. The passenger door flew open. "Get in!" James dove inside, barely slamming the door shut before the driver hit the gas. The SUV behind them lurched forward, its headlights slicing through the darkness. James twisted in his seat, heart pounding. "You sure this thing can outrun them?" The driver, a sharp-eyed woman with a cigarette tucked behind her ear, grinned. "Watch me." The car tore down the street, tires screeching. James braced himself as they swerved onto the main road, weaving through traffic. A glance at the rearview mirror showed 2 squad cars in pursuit. His stomach twisted. If they got caught, it was over. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his spare phone. He powered it up long enough to send one message. "I have it. Need extraction?" A beat passed. Then, Maya's name flashed on his screen. "Do not stop. No matter what." James gritted his teeth. He wasn't planning to. The holding cell was colder than Maya remembered. The thin mattress beneath her barely cushioned the hard metal frame, and the flickering light overhead cast long, eerie shadows across the cracked cement floor. The air smelled of sweat and disinfectant, a mix of hopelessness and control. She wasn't supposed to be here, but if the system thought it could bury her, it was about to learn just how wrong it was. She sat upright as the heavy steel door groaned open, revealing a broad-shouldered guard in a Navy uniform. His expression was blank, the kind that came from years of following orders without question. "I need to speak to my lawyer," Maya said before he could speak. The guard barely glanced at her. "Not an option." She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice steady. "You know that's illegal, right? Denying a detainee access to legal counsel violates the Sixth Amendment." The guard hesitated, shifting on his feet. He wasn't expecting a challenge. Maya leaned forward slightly. "You can either let me make my call, or we can both sit here while I document every civil rights violation you and your department are stacking up. Your choice." The guard's jaw tightened. "Sit tight." Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Maya sighed. She had expected that. They weren't going to make this easy. Later that afternoon, Maya found herself in the yard, a small, fenced-in slab of concrete where detainees were allowed brief moments of fresh air. The sun was high, but the heat did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. She needed allies. She scanned the yard, spotting Elena Torres leaning against the chain-link fence. Arms crossed, her dark eyes wary. Next to her, Kevin Brooks sat on a bench, bouncing his knee restlessly. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, as if he wanted to disappear. Maya walked toward them, stopping just a few feet away. Elena looked her up and down. "What do you want?" Maya met her gaze. "A conversation." Kevin let out a dry chuckle. Lady, people like us don't get conversations. We get charges. Maya sat down across from them, her tone calm but firm. Then maybe it's time to change that. Elena raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? I'm a lawyer, Maya said simply. Or at least I was before they threw me in here. And I know for a fact that none of us belong behind these bars. Kevin scoffed. That's rich. You think just because you know the law, it's going to save you? It doesn't work like that. Maya nodded slowly. You're right. The system isn't built for people like us. But that doesn't mean we let it win. Elena studied her for a long moment. What are you proposing? A fight, Maya said, but not with fists, with something they can't ignore. She gestured toward the other detainees in the yard. Women, men, people who had been swept into the system for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. If we make enough noise, Maya continued, if we push hard enough, the media will have no choice but to pay attention. Kevin frowned. You want a riot? No, Maya said. I want a movement. Elena exhaled sharply. Damn, you really are serious about this. Maya didn't blink. Are you in? Elena glanced at Kevin. He shrugged. I mean, if we're already stuck here, he muttered, might as well make it worth something. Elena smirked. All right, lawyer, let's see what you got. Across town, Mark Reynolds leaned back in his chair, watching Murphy from behind his desk. The blinds were half drawn, casting jagged stripes of light across the polished wood. Murphy stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. You look nervous, officer, Reynolds mused, his tone casual but sharp. Murphy forced himself to hold his gaze. I don't know what you mean, sir. Reynolds chuckled. Sure you do. You've been acting different, and I don't like different. Murphy clenched his jaw. You wouldn't happen to know anything about our recent security breach, would you? Reynolds continued, tilting his head. Murphy's fingers twitched. No, sir. Reynolds studied him for a moment longer, then smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Good, he said. Because if I find out someone in this department has been disloyal, well, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. We both know what happens to rats. Murphy's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to nod. Understood, sir. Reynolds leaned back again. Glad to hear it. Murphy turned on his heel and walked out, his heart hammering. He had to move faster. That night, Maya sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the cement wall. A rustling sound caught her attention. She turned just as a folded piece of paper was slipped through the bars. Frowning, she unfolded it. We have to act now. No name, but she knew exactly who it was from. Her pulse quickened. She had spent her whole life fighting battles in courtrooms. Now it was time to take the fight somewhere else. James sat in the farthest corner of a small cafe just outside Memphis, his back pressed against the worn wooden booth. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside his laptop, untouched and long gone cold. The walls were lined with faded pictures of old blues musicians, their somber expressions matching the weight in his chest. He had been running for the past 24 hours, dodging cops, switching burner phones, and keeping his head low. But hiding wasn't getting him anywhere. The video file sat on his screen, waiting. It wasn't complete. The footage was missing key moments. But it was enough to prove that Maya hadn't broken any laws when Reynolds pulled her over. It showed her calmly asking for a reason for the stop. It showed the moment Reynolds yanked her out of the car. It showed the way she had been thrown against the hood like a criminal. It was enough to get people talking. But was it enough to take Reynolds down? James clenched his jaw. He had two choices. If he released the footage now, it would go viral, stir up anger, and put pressure on the department. But without concrete proof of Reynolds' corruption, without a full account of the evidence he had erased, it might not be enough to force real action. If he waited, dug deeper, and risked another move, he might find the missing pieces that would bring the entire system crashing down. Both choices carried risk. His phone vibrated. James exhaled sharply and picked it up. A message from Emily Tran. We need to talk. Now. Emily Tran was one of the sharpest reporters at CBS. She had covered civil rights cases before, but this wasn't just another assignment for her. This was personal. When James arrived at the meeting spot, an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town, Emily was already waiting in her car, tapping impatiently against the steering wheel. As soon as he slid into the passenger seat, she turned to him. "You're reckless," she said. "You know that, right?" James smirked. "And yet, here you are." She sighed, rubbing her temple. "Let me guess. You have the footage?" James pulled out his laptop and pressed play. Emily leaned in, eyes narrowing as she watched the grainy footage of Maya's arrest. When the video ended, she sat back, arms crossed. "This is good," she admitted, "but it's not enough." James tensed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this will get attention? Sure. People will be outraged for a few days, but without proof that Reynolds tried to erase the evidence, without something that connects him directly to a cover-up, this won't stick." James ran a hand through his hair. "Then we get more." Emily gave him a hard look. "How much are you willing to risk?" James didn't hesitate. "Everything." Inside the holding facility, Maya could feel the tension shifting. She wasn't the only one who had been wrongfully arrested. The women around her had their own stories. Stories of false charges, of brutality, of being tossed into the system and forgotten. And now she was giving them a reason to speak up. She stood in the middle of the common area, her voice steady. "They want us to stay silent," she said, scanning the faces around her. "They want us to believe that no one cares. But we know the truth, and we are not alone." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena Torres crossed her arms. "So what's the plan, lawyer?" Maya exhaled. "We make them listen." It started small, just a few voices raised in protest. Then it grew. One by one, women began chanting, "Justice for all! Justice for all!" Guards rushed to the doors, barking orders, but no one backed down. The volume swelled, bouncing off the concrete walls, reaching beyond the bars. Maya felt the momentum shift. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Shut it down!" But they didn't, because they had found their power. Across town, Reynolds sat behind his desk, listening to the report from the detention center. He clenched his fists. Maya Johnson wasn't just sitting quietly in a cell, waiting to be forgotten. She was fighting back. And now the noise was getting too loud to ignore. He picked up his phone. "Put her in solitary," he ordered. "Now." The officer on the other end hesitated. "Sir, if we—" "I said now." Reynolds slammed the phone down, his jaw tight. She thought she could win. He'd show her what it meant to lose. Maya barely flinched when they came for her. Two guards flanked her, their grips firm as they led her down the dimly lit hallway. Solitary confinement. A dark, windowless box meant to break people. But as the heavy steel door closed behind her, she didn't feel fear. She felt something else. Anticipation. Because Reynolds had just made a mistake. He thought cutting her off would silence her. But she had already sent the message. And now it was only a matter of time. James Carter sat behind the wheel of a borrowed sedan, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The rain pelted against the windshield, the rhythmic slap of the wipers barely keeping up. He had spent the past 48 hours running, changing locations, switching burner phones, and staying off the grid. But now the hunt was official. The Memphis PD had issued a warrant for his arrest. The charge? Unauthorized access to a government system, a flimsy accusation meant to paint him as a criminal rather than a journalist exposing corruption. His burner phone buzzed. Anna's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "They're tracking you, James. Your last phone pinged in Midtown before you ditched it. They're locking down the main roads." James let out a slow breath, thinking fast. "Tell me you have something." "Working on it. I've scrambled your GPS signal, but it's only a matter of time before they realize it's fake. You need to move." He glanced in the rearview mirror. The city lights flickered in the distance, the traffic thinning as he reached the industrial district. There weren't many places left to hide. Then through the static of the call, Anna's voice turned deadly serious. "Reynolds isn't just after you to shut you up. He's making this personal." James swallowed hard. He had expected retaliation, but now it was clear. Reynolds wasn't just trying to contain the damage. He was hunting him down. Reynolds stood in the dimly lit office of the Memphis Police Department, watching the rain streak down the window. The glow of a monitor reflected off his hardened features as he read through the latest updates on the James Carter manhunt. One of his officers entered, hesitating slightly before speaking. "Sir, Carter hasn't been found yet. He's moving too fast." Reynolds turned slowly, his gaze cold. "Then move faster." The officer cleared his throat. "We've blocked the exits out of the city, but there's something else. The video, it's spreading. People are talking." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had seen it himself. The footage of Maya's unlawful arrest was everywhere. Social media, independent news sites, even whispers on national networks. It wasn't enough to take him down. Not yet. But it was enough to put him under scrutiny. Enough to make people doubt him. And that was dangerous. He grabbed his radio and barked, "I want Carter found before sunrise." No excuses. He had spent years building his power. He wasn't about to lose it to some reporter. James parked behind an abandoned warehouse, engine off, the rain drumming against the roof. He needed a plan. Fast. His phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message. "Meet me. Warehouse 12. Come alone." No name. James's stomach twisted. It could be a trap, or it could be his only way out. He slipped out of the car, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind, and made his way through the shadows. His footsteps echoed against the wet pavement, the faint hum of the city, a distant reminder that life was still moving on outside this chaos. Then, movement. James tensed. Someone was already there. A figure stepped out from the darkness. Murphy. James froze. His instincts screamed at him to run, but Murphy raised a hand, voice low. "I'm not here to arrest you." James narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Murphy took a cautious step closer, glancing over his shoulder. "Because you're right. Reynolds is dirty, and I have proof." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black hard drive. James didn't move. "What is that?" Murphy exhaled. "Everything. Internal footage. Reports that never made it past the system. Complaints that were buried. You wanted to bring Reynolds down?" He pressed the device into James's hand. "This will do it." James's fingers curled around the hard drive. If this was real, it wasn't just a scandal. It was evidence that could dismantle an entire department. But before he could say another word, a car screeched to a stop nearby. Headlights flared. Murphy's eyes widened. "Go! Now!" James barely had time to react before the doors swung open. Reynolds had found them. Meanwhile, in a small, solitary confinement cell, Maya Johnson sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. The walls around her were bare, the light dim, the silence pressing. But she wasn't afraid. She had been in worse places than this. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her sleeve, smoothing it out against her knee. It wasn't much, just a rough draft of a legal motion. But it was something. She had spent her entire career defending others. Now, she would defend herself. She picked up the small pencil they had given her, the dull tip dragging against the page as she began to write. The law was supposed to serve justice, but justice didn't come to those who waited. It came to those who fought for it. She thought of her father's words, words he had repeated to her ever since she was a child. Justice is never given. It must be taken. Maya's hand tightened around the pencil. Tomorrow everything would change. She would make sure of it. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, the murmur of hushed conversations blending into an undercurrent of tension. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, cameras poised, ready to capture every moment. Activists lined the back rows, their presence a quiet but unmistakable declaration that this case was bigger than just one woman. It was about a system that had gone unchecked for too long. Maya sat at the defense table, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in a dark blue suit, her hands resting loosely on the table. The jumpsuit was gone, but the fight was far from over. Across from her, Mark Reynolds sat stiffly in the witness section. His suit was crisp, his expression neutral, but Maya could see the tension in his shoulders. His fingers drummed against the wooden armrest, betraying the calm facade he tried so hard to maintain. The judge, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses, adjusted her robes before clearing her throat. "Let's proceed." The prosecutor, a sharp-jawed man named Robert Hastings, rose from his seat. He was no stranger to high-profile cases, and today he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hastings began, pacing in front of them, "what we have here is a case of defiance. A woman who refused to follow lawful orders, who disrupted public order, and now conveniently claims to be a victim." Maya held her expression steady. Hastings turned to her. "Miss Johnson, do you believe you're above the law?" Maya met his gaze. "Number, I believe the law should be applied fairly. That's why I'm here." Hastings smirked. "And yet you resisted a direct order from a police officer?" She leaned forward slightly. "I asked for the reason I was being stopped. That's my right." Hastings waved a hand dismissively. "Miss Johnson, this isn't about your rights. This is about your actions. You escalated the situation, and now you're trying to paint yourself as an innocent victim." Maya felt her pulse steady. She had expected this. Hastings turned to the jury, his voice calm but cutting. "This trial isn't just about her. It's about whether we allow individuals to defy law enforcement without consequence. If we excuse this behavior, what message does that send?" The room was silent. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. James Carter stepped inside, his suit slightly disheveled, a hard drive clutched in his hand. The courtroom immediately buzzed with whispers as heads turned toward him. Maya exhaled slowly. She had been waiting for this moment. Hastings spun on his heel, his expression twisting in irritation. "Your Honor, I was not informed of a new witness." James strode forward, handing a folder to Maya's attorney. "Apologies for the interruption, but I have evidence that is directly relevant to this case." Maya's attorney, Lisa Monroe, a seasoned civil rights lawyer, barely glanced at the contents before turning to the judge. "Your Honor, we have new evidence proving that this case is built on false pretenses." Hastings scoffed. "This is highly irregular." The judge raised a brow. "What kind of evidence?" James took a breath. "Security footage from inside the Memphis Police Department. It contains records of illegal orders given by Officer Reynolds, including the attempted destruction of exculpatory evidence." The room fell into stunned silence. Reynolds stiffened. Hastings shook his head. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence was illegally obtained. We have no proof that it wasn't tampered with." Lisa stepped forward. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court has ruled that evidence proving a miscarriage of justice is admissible, even if obtained through unconventional means. If this footage proves law enforcement misconduct, it is critical to this case." The judge leaned forward, studying the two attorneys. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of the decision pressing down on everyone. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded. "Let's see it." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. A grainy video appeared, surveillance footage from inside the Memphis PD. The audio was clear, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Reynolds' voice came first. "Erase the dash cam footage. I don't want this coming back on me." The jury collectively tensed. Another voice, Murphy, hesitant. "Sir, if we do that, you want to keep your job? Then do what I say." Then another clip, Reynolds laughing with another officer. "She thought she could question me. She thought she had rights. Not tonight." A murmur swept through the courtroom. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough." The video cut out, leaving only heavy silence behind. Reynolds, pale now, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Maya felt something shift in the room. The tide was turning. Hastings, now visibly rattled, scrambled to recover. "Your Honor, this evidence does not negate the fact that Miss Johnson resisted arrest." Lisa didn't miss a beat. "Resisting an unlawful arrest is not a crime, and this video proves that Officer Reynolds abused his authority." The judge sighed, rubbing her temple. "We'll take a recess before proceeding further." The gavel hit the wood. Court adjourned. Maya finally allowed herself a breath. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, thick and suffocating. Every eye in the room was locked on the screen at the front, where the grainy footage from Maya's dash cam played. The video was irrefutable. Maya's car moving steadily within the speed limit. No swerving, no reckless driving, just an ordinary night on the road, until the sudden flash of red and blue lights behind her. Then came the voice of Mark Reynolds, sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle." The courtroom remained frozen as the next part played, the moment Reynolds yanked her out before she could even ask why. The way he pinned her against the hood, twisting her arms behind her back, the smug expression on his face as he tightened the cuffs around her wrists. Maya didn't look away. She had lived this moment, but now the world was seeing it too. Then the footage shifted. This time it wasn't from her car. It was from inside the Memphis Police Department, surveillance footage Murphy had retrieved. The grainy black and white recording flickered to life, showing a tense exchange between Reynolds and one of his subordinates. "Erase the dash cam footage," Reynolds ordered. A nervous Murphy hesitated in the video. "Sir, that's illegal. If this gets out—" "I don't care, do it. You want to keep your badge?" Gas rippled through the courtroom. Maya didn't have to look at the jury to know what they were thinking. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. Reynolds looked nervous. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the bright courtroom lights. "That footage, it's taken out of context," he stammered. The prosecutor, Robert Hastings, turned toward him with a sharp glare. "So you're saying that you ordering an officer to destroy evidence is taken out of context?" Reynolds licked his lips. His gaze flicked toward the jury, then the judge. "I never ordered that. Murphy, he must have acted alone. This is a setup." A murmur spread across the room. And then Murphy stood up. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the railing in front of him. "I am willing to testify." The room erupted. The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court." Murphy turned toward the jury. "I've been part of this system for years. I've seen how it works, and I've seen how men like Reynolds operate." His jaw clenched. "I was too afraid to speak up before, but I can't stay silent anymore." Reynolds slammed his fist against the table. "You little—" "That's enough," the judge snapped. Reynolds clenched his jaw, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Maya stood, her heart pounding, as she walked to the center of the room. This was her moment. She met the eyes of the jury, then the people seated behind them. Activists, reporters, community members, people who had come not just to witness a trial, but to see if justice was still possible. She took a slow breath, and then she spoke. "I was arrested because I asked a question," she began, "because I didn't accept an abuse of power without reason." Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "What happened to me is not an isolated case. It happens in cities across this country, to people who don't have a voice, to those who are told to accept injustice as normal." She turned slightly, her gaze landing on the judge. "But the law is supposed to protect people, not be used as a weapon against them." A hush fell over the room. "I stand here today, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been told their rights don't matter, for everyone who has been silenced, mistreated, or forgotten." She exhaled. "And I ask this court, will you let this be the moment where that changes?" For a beat, no one spoke. Then slowly, one of the jurors nodded, and another, and another. Reynolds sank into his chair, his face pale. The prosecutor cleared his throat, struggling to regain control. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct—" The judge cut him off. "This court orders the immediate detainment of Officer Mark Reynolds pending a full investigation into misconduct, perjury, and obstruction of justice." Reynolds' head snapped up. "You can't do this!" The judge banged the gavel. "Bailiffs, remove the defendant from the courtroom." Two uniformed officers stepped forward. Reynolds' mask shattered. "You don't understand," he hissed as they pulled him from his seat. "I made this system work. Without me, you have nothing." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters surged forward. Voices clashed. The sound of camera shutters filled the air. But Maya? She stood still. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt the weight start to lift. This battle was over, but the war for justice had just begun. The cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every second of Mark Reynolds being escorted out of the courthouse. His wrists were locked in handcuffs, his face a mixture of defiance and barely restrained panic. The once powerful officer was now just another man in shackles, his years of unchecked authority crumbling before the eyes of the public. The news vans lined the street, Their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the moment in real time. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices blending into a chaotic storm of questions. "Chief Reynolds, do you have anything to say about the charges against you? Were you acting alone, or is this part of a larger cover-up? Do you regret your actions?" Reynolds kept his gaze forward, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his temple. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was no longer in control. The headlines were instant. Police chief arrested amid corruption scandal. Shocking body cam footage sparks DOJ investigation. Memphis PD under fire. How deep does the corruption go? But this wasn't just a local story anymore. Within hours, the Department of Justice announced it would be launching a full investigation into the Memphis Police Department. Audits were being ordered. Case files were being reopened. Internal affairs was on high alert. The system that had once protected Reynolds was turning on him. Maya stood just outside the courthouse steps, the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. She wasn't smiling. There was no victory lap, no overwhelming sense of triumph, because she knew the truth. Taking down one corrupt officer wasn't the same as dismantling a broken system. A cluster of reporters broke through the barricades, their microphones pushing toward her. "Miss Johnson, how does it feel to have won?" Maya inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay composed. "This wasn't about winning," she said. Her voice was steady but firm. "This was about exposing the truth. But one trial doesn't fix a system that allows people like Reynolds to abuse their power in the first place." A younger journalist pushed forward. "What happens next? Do you think this will bring real change?" Maya exhaled. "I hope so. But hope isn't enough. We need accountability. We need transparency. And most of all, we need people to keep paying attention." She turned to the cameras, letting her words reach beyond the crowd, beyond the courthouse, into homes across the country. "This isn't just my fight. This is a fight for everyone who has ever been silenced, for everyone who has ever been told their rights didn't matter. This is a wake-up call." The cameras kept rolling, but Maya had said what she needed to say. She stepped back, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a newfound purpose. But far from the courthouse, in a dimly lit office deep inside the Memphis PD headquarters, a different conversation was happening. A group of high-ranking officers sat around a long wooden table. Their faces were shadowed under the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. Reynolds had been one of them, and now he was gone. An older officer, his grizzled face lined with years of quiet survival, finally broke the silence. "She got lucky." His voice was low, controlled. "But luck runs out." Another officer leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "She didn't just take down Reynolds. She made us all look weak." A younger, leaner man with cold blue eyes finally spoke. His voice was like ice. "The problem with people like Maya Johnson," he said, fingers tapping against the table, "is that they don't know when to stop." The room fell still. And then, a decision was made. Maya Johnson had chipped away at their power. Now they would remind her who really controlled the city. Maya stepped into the cool night air, exhaustion creeping into her bones. She had spent the past several hours answering questions, watching Reynolds be taken away, trying to process everything. But as she walked toward the waiting car, a chill ran down her spine. Something felt off, a presence, a feeling, like she was being watched. She paused, glancing around. The courthouse parking lot was mostly empty, but there, across the street near the shadows of an alley, she spotted a figure standing still, just beyond the streetlights. Her stomach tightened. A man in a dark coat, not moving, not speaking, just watching. Her fingers instinctively gripped her purse strap, her pulse quickening. Then, as if sensing that she had noticed, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. Maya exhaled sharply. She had won a battle today, but something told her the war was far from over. Maya sat in the back corner of a dimly lit cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The air smelled of roasted beans and the faint hint of cinnamon, but the warmth of the cafe did little to ease the tension sitting heavy in her chest. Across from her, Murphy leaned forward, his expression tight. "We need to talk," he said, voice low. Maya didn't flinch. She had expected this conversation ever since Reynolds had been led away in handcuffs. Murphy glanced over his shoulder before continuing. You think taking down Reynolds was the end of it? He shook his head. You just scratched the surface. Maya lifted an eyebrow. I figured as much. Murphy exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. It's worse than you think. Reynolds was powerful, but he wasn't the one pulling all the strings. His voice dropped further. There's a group, high-ranking officers, political players, people who have everything to lose if the corruption inside the department comes to light. Maya stayed quiet, letting him talk. They're not happy that you made Reynolds their sacrificial lamb, Murphy continued. Word is they're planning to shut you up. Maya's grip on her cup tightened. Let them try. Murphy looked frustrated. This isn't a game, Maya. They don't issue threats. They make people disappear. She studied him for a long moment. His hands were fidgeting. He wasn't the same man she had seen testifying in court. He was afraid. How do you know all this? She finally asked. Murphy hesitated. I still have friends on the inside. Some of them think what you did was right, he exhaled. But some of them think you need to be handled. Maya felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't naive. She knew that taking down a man like Reynolds didn't mean the entire rotting system would fall with him, but she hadn't expected the backlash to come this fast. They're watching you, Murphy added. I don't know what their next move is, but you need to be careful. Maya met his gaze. I appreciate the warning, Murphy, but I'm not going anywhere. He shook his head, frustrated. I had a feeling you'd say that. He slid a piece of paper across the table. That's my burner number. If anything happens, call me. She picked it up, folding it neatly into her pocket. Murphy stood, casting one last glance around the cafe before walking out into the night. Maya sat there for a moment, taking a slow breath. She knew this fight wasn't over, but now it was clear. This was just the beginning. Hours later, Maya stepped out of her law office, the night air crisp against her skin. The city was quieter now, the streets mostly empty, except for the occasional distant hum of traffic. She adjusted the strap of her bag and started toward her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Then, a prickle at the back of her neck, a feeling, the unmistakable sense of being watched. She didn't break her stride, but her eyes flicked toward the shadows. The street lamps cast long stretches of darkness between parked cars, and for a second, she thought she saw movement. Then, as she reached the parking lot, she heard it, the low, steady purr of an engine. Maya turned slightly, her pulse spiking. A black SUV was creeping behind her. Its headlights dimmed, its windows tinted. It wasn't moving fast. It was following her. She kept walking, trying to act as if she hadn't noticed. Don't panic. Don't run. Instead of heading straight for her car, she took a sharp turn toward a different exit. The SUV followed. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over Murphy's number. But before she could dial, the SUV came to a stop. Two men stepped out, both in dark jackets, both watching her. Maya took a slow step back. One of them smirked. You should really learn when to let things go. The other took a step closer. You've been making a lot of noise, Miss Johnson. His voice was eerily calm. That's a dangerous habit. Maya squared her shoulders, forcing herself to stand her ground. Is that a threat? She asked. The first man chuckled. A warning. He gestured toward the empty street. Accidents happen all the time in this city. Her hands clenched into fists. She had faced men like this before. Bullies. But this was different. This wasn't just about intimidation. This was a promise. One of the men pulled a small card from his pocket and flicked it toward her. It landed at her feet. Be smart, he said. Stay quiet. Then they turned, got back into their SUV, and drove away. Maya didn't move. Her chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. She reached down, picking up the card. It was blank, except for one word printed neatly in the center. Enough. Maya exhaled. She knew exactly what they wanted, and she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done, not even close. Maya sat in her small office, staring at the blank card left by the men in the SUV. Enough. A warning. A threat. She could still hear their voices in her head, the weight of their words pressing against her ribs. You should learn to stay quiet. She knew what they wanted. They expected fear to stop her. They thought she'd pack up, move on, and let the system protect itself. They were wrong. Maya reached for her phone. She wasn't going to the police, not when so many of them were still protecting the same corrupt system she was trying to expose. Instead, she made a different call. James Carter answered after one ring. "You got something?" he asked, his voice sharp, direct. "I need you to push this story harder," Maya said. "I need more than just the news cycle. We need everyone to see what's happening." There was a pause. Then James exhaled. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next morning, Maya walked into the CBS studio for a live, nationally broadcasted interview. The producer greeted her with a tight smile, shuffling her into makeup while Emily Tran, the investigative journalist who had picked up the case, reviewed her notes. Emily glanced up. "Are you ready for this?" Maya met her gaze through the mirror. "They think they can scare me into silence." She turned to face Emily. "Let's show them they're wrong." Minutes later, the cameras went live. Emily wasted no time. Maya Johnson, former federal prosecutor and civil rights attorney, has been at the center of one of the biggest police corruption cases in Memphis history. "Miss Johnson, can you tell us what's happening now?" Maya folded her hands on the desk in front of her. The studio was bright, but she focused only on the camera, knowing millions of people were watching. "After exposing Officer Reynolds and the abuses within the Memphis Police Department, I received a warning, directly from the people trying to bury the truth." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A warning?" Maya nodded. "Two men followed me, confronted me, and told me to stay quiet. They didn't even bother to hide their intentions." A murmur spread across the studio. Emily leaned forward. "So what are you going to do?" Maya's lips pressed into a firm line. "I'm going to keep talking." She turned to the camera. "This is bigger than one man, bigger than Reynolds. This is about a system that has allowed officers to operate above the law, unchecked for years. And now, those in power are afraid. They don't want the world to see what they've done." She reached into her bag, pulling out a thick folder. Emily blinked. "What is that?" Maya laid it on the desk. "Inside this folder are 25 case files, 25 instances where innocent people were arrested, abused, and silenced by corrupt officers." Gasps rippled through the newsroom. Maya continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "Some of these people are still in prison. Some of them never made it out." She let the words settle. "And this isn't just about Memphis. This is happening everywhere." Emily straightened. "Are you saying this is part of a larger network of corruption?" Maya exhaled. "Yes, and I have proof." The studio erupted into whispers, but Maya wasn't done. She turned back to the camera, her words cutting through the noise. "To those in power who think they can intimidate me, I am not afraid of you." Silence. Then, Emily looked directly into the camera. "We will continue following this case closely. Stay with us." The broadcast ended. But the story, it was just beginning. The response was immediate. Social media exploded. Hashtag Justice for Memphis began trending nationwide. Civil rights organizations started calling for a federal investigation. And in a private boardroom, a group of powerful men sat in silence as they watched Maya's interview play on the news. One of them, a sharp-dressed man in his 60s, turned to the others. "This is getting out of control," he muttered. A younger officer leaned forward, face dark. "We should have handled her before it got to this point." The man at the head of the table, Samuel Whitmore, the mayor of Memphis, finally spoke. "We underestimated her." His voice was even, but his eyes were cold. "That was a mistake." A beat of silence. Then Whitmore stood. "We're done playing defense." But Maya was already ahead of them. Hours before the broadcast, she had met with FBI agents in a secure location. She slid a USB drive across the table. "Inside this drive," she said, "are documents, financial records, and internal memos connecting high-ranking officers to an organized cover-up within the Memphis Police Department." The lead agent picked up the drive. "Where did you get this?" Maya's expression remained unreadable. "Let's just say, there are still people in the system who believe in justice." The agent studied her for a long moment before nodding. We'll open a full federal investigation. Maya leaned back, exhaling. It was happening. By the next morning, the fallout began. The FBI issued arrest warrants for several senior officers. Some of them resigned before they could be detained. Others vanished overnight. And then, the bombshell. Mayor Samuel Whitmore was placed under investigation. It was a name no one expected, a name that changed everything. From his jail cell, Reynolds watched the news, his hands clenched into fists. His voice was a whisper. She's burning it all down. And he realized Maya Johnson wasn't stopping until the whole corrupt empire collapsed. Maya stepped outside the FBI building, the sun breaking through the clouds. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't over. The people she had exposed would fight back harder than ever. But for now, she had delivered a blow they couldn't ignore. As she walked toward her car, James Carter pulled up beside her, rolling down his window. "You did it," he said. Maya smiled faintly. "Not yet, but I'm damn close." And with that, she stepped into the next battle. Because this wasn't just a case, this was a revolution. The courtroom was packed once again, this time for a moment of reckoning. The air, once thick with tension, now buzzed with the energy of a city on the edge of change. The men who had orchestrated the corruption, Mark Reynolds and Samuel Whitmore, were finally being held accountable. Reynolds sat at the defense table, his head hung low. Guilty, a verdict that came down like a hammer. 20 years in federal prison, sentenced for his abuse of power and destruction of evidence. The weight of the sentence crushed him, but it wasn't just the years behind bars that stung. It was the fact that he was no longer the untouchable force he had once been. Across town, Samuel Whitmore, the mayor of Memphis, faced a different kind of reckoning. Forced to resign after a mountain of documents detailing his involvement in a vast network of corruption were leaked to the press, he walked away from the position he had held for years. The public outrage was overwhelming. He would never have the power he once did. Meanwhile, the Memphis Police Department was placed under federal oversight, an independent review board now in charge of cleaning up the mess left behind. For the first time in a long while, the men and women who had once been untouchable now had to answer to the very people they had sworn to serve. But amidst the storm of justice, Maya found herself at the center of something much larger than she had ever anticipated. Maya Johnson was now a symbol. She stood before a crowd of thousands, her presence a beacon for the reform she had fought for. Human rights organizations, activists, and community leaders rallied behind her, their voices echoing in support of the changes she had sparked. Maya was celebrated as a hero, her actions hailed as a triumph for justice. James Carter, too, was recognized for his work. His relentless pursuit of the truth, his dedication to uncovering the story that no one else dared touch, earned him accolades across the country. His career had skyrocketed since the Memphis case, and his name had become synonymous with investigative journalism at its finest. Then there was Murphy. Once a part of the corrupt system, he now stood as a key witness in the federal investigation, his testimony proving crucial in bringing down those who had abused their power. Though he had lost his job at the Memphis Police Department, Murphy was given a second chance, a chance to rebuild and perhaps to make amends. But for Maya, the battle had never been about personal gain. As she stood in front of the podium, accepting her role as a symbol of reform, something still gnawed at her. She had won this fight, yes, but there were still shadows lurking in the corners of the system, shadows that would never be completely erased. That night, alone in her office, Maya sat at her desk, reviewing case files for the next round of battles. She had barely noticed the envelope on her desk until it had caught the light. A single plain envelope with no return address. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing the paper inside. The message was brief. "You think you've won? The game has only just begun." Maya's breath caught in her throat, but she wasn't afraid. She had expected this. She had known all along that the system was more than just a few corrupt officers. It was a machine that would fight back. She set the letter aside, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. They wanted to play games. She was ready. Maya stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city of Memphis, the lights twinkling like tiny stars below. The city had changed in the past few months, and with it, so had the people. They were beginning to believe, to feel like they had a voice. But as Maya stood there staring at the horizon, she knew this wasn't the end. Tomorrow a new fight would begin, and she wouldn't back down. Justice is never given freely. It must be fought for, earned, and protected. Maya Johnson's story is a reminder that standing up to corruption comes at a cost, but the price of silence is far greater. This wasn't just a fight against one corrupt officer or a broken department. It was a battle for accountability, for a system that should serve all people equally, not just those in power. And while Maya may have won this round, the struggle for justice is far from over. So what do you think? How can we continue to hold those in power accountable? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the truth behind power, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come, and we'll be here to tell it. Until next time.